comply with powerful individuals pursuing aims that they say are undergirded by real science, but are clearly underwritten by something more plain and more plainly malfeasant: greed, a desire for power. Microsoft remains one of the biggest corporations in the world. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a significant donor to organisations like the WHO, who have power that's not just symbolic, but real legislative power. And if you want to know someone who's been at the arse end of it, why, look no further than your friend, old Russ here, who has a strike on the YouTube simply for speaking out against the WHO. And I love the people that watch us over there on YouTube, but that's why we had to come here, so that we had the ability to speak plainly and openly. Gareth, we've got to go to Max Blumenthal, because you do not keep a man like Max Blumenthal waiting. He's waiting to talk to us now. We're going to have to put headphones on so we can just absorb his information. Max, earlier in the show, we were talking about the mainstream media's reporting on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, in particular the jubilance and jingoism that has framed the return of Ukrainian forces to Kherson. And anyone would understand and support the victory of Ukrainian people who have known such suffering during this conflict. But is there something irresponsible in presenting just one side of the story? And do you think we're being given a fair depiction of events in the Ukraine and Russia war right now? And what in particular do you think is being neglected, and why, Max?
Well, you're right, Russell. There's been a lot of celebration of the Ukrainian military's successful offensive in the Kherson region, and specifically the city of Kherson in southern Ukraine. And Russia has retreated from the West Bank of the Dnieper River and established a new line of defense. This is not something that Russia really wanted to have happen. But whose victory are we talking about among the Ukrainian people, and who are the Ukrainian people? See, these are questions that go to the heart of this conflict and help us provide a context for understanding why this conflict is taking place, what motivated Russia to enter in February, and how this war has actually been going on for 8 years. Because as we see now in Kherson, and you're going to have to look on social media to see this, you can look at my Twitter account, you can see it on Telegram channels, and CNN has inadvertently shown some of it along with the AP. Members of that 30% of the Ukrainian population who are ethnic Russian, who have been officially disenfranchised, had their language stripped as an official language, been attacked, slaughtered, jailed, threatened by the regime that was installed with a US-backed coup in 2014. They are being tortured, disappeared, and kidnapped inside Kherson right now because they're suspected of Russian sympathies by the Ukrainian so-called liberators. So for them, this is not a liberation. It's why Russia, before withdrawing its forces, evacuated 80,000 civilians from Kherson, because they would all be targets of the Ukrainian military. And they've done this all across areas that they've supposedly liberated. Before this, we saw it in areas outside Kharkiv, like the town of Kupiansk, for example. Neo-Nazi battalion leader named Maxim Zorin actually published on Telegram video of his men dumping the bodies of civilians into a mass grave that they just executed after accusing him of Russian sympathies. And now we see the same thing happening in Kherson: soldiers torturing, mocking, bound civilians, civilians being bound to poles and mocked by the local pro-Ukrainian population. And we've also seen the soldiers coming in with Nazi insignia on their uniforms, like the Totenkopf, which was worn by the Nazi SS in World War II. One apparently pro-Ukrainian civilian was, I think it was an accident, shown by CNN on a national broadcast yesterday, sig-heiling as he rode through the town with a Ukrainian flag. I mean, maybe he was sig-heiling, maybe he was just stretching his arm after torturing collaborators. I don't know what was happening there, but it was an obvious sig-heil. So what happened the next day? The Ukrainian government banned CNN and Sky News and other networks from the town because they said that their so-called stabilization activities were not complete. So, we're not just talking about some anomalous situation. This is the violence that the entire ethnic Russian population, or much of the ethnic Russian population, in Ukraine, a large segment of the Ukrainian people has faced for the last 8 years. And it's what fueled this conflict in the Donbass region. And that's a picture that the American public just doesn't get from their media. They're constantly told this is just an unprovoked invasion by a madman who wants to reestablish the Soviet Union.
Do you think that these stories are not reported in the mainstream media just because it's too complex for people to handle, that there's good and bad on both sides of any conflict? Why is it that we're continually offered, as we were in that report, like sort of saccharine scenes of a grandmother greeting a soldier, which of course, that's kind of beautiful that that's happening. I'm not suggesting that the Ukrainian people that have suffered as a result of this war don't deserve sympathy and support. What I'm more interested in is the reason that we are just given such a simplistic rendering of this story, whose objectives are better met by extracting complexity from this narrative. Why is it that we're not allowed to be given the information? Look, there's some complexity here. We participate in this way. How do we find ourselves here, Max? Why is it so diluted and so anodyne and so reductive?
Well, the answer is pretty simple. The American public, which is detached from the war physically and geographically, needs to not question where their money is going. And some $80 billion of American money has flowed into the pockets of Ukrainian warlords, into arms dealers, and into the contractors in one of the greatest money laundering operations since Afghanistan. I mean, we remember Julian Assange when he commented on Afghanistan in 2011. He said, this war is just about extracting trillions of dollars from the public and running it through the weapons companies and the big contractors, but running it through Afghanistan. They just need a justification for doing that. So you can't start telling the American public that there are political complexities here, that this is not a battle of good and evil, that this is not a new World War II, or that Ukraine is actually not a democracy. It is an authoritarian state that, like Russia, is cracking down on opposition media. It's basically banned all opposition media, that Zelensky has banned all opposition parties, that he's had his main opponent who ran against him in 2019 jailed and beaten by the Ukrainian SBU, that human rights activists inside Ukraine who question the war are being disappeared. You can't tell that to the American public. On the human rights issue, it will start to weaken liberal support for the war, and conservative support for the war will start to be weakened when you start to tell them that this is not a moral crusade. So these scenes from Kherson are coming at a time when the Biden administration is pushing back on calls for negotiations. And who are they pushing back against, Russell? They're pushing back against the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the U.S. military, of the Pentagon, Mark Milley, who's saying this is a time to start talking about peace. Why? Because there's another aspect to Kherson that is extremely dangerous that Americans need to understand. It will be, if Russia's defense is somehow broken on the other side of the Dnieper River, a launching pad for attacking Crimea. And that is the ultimate red line for Russia. If Crimea is attacked, that can take us towards nuclear war. It can which could lead towards a direct intervention from NATO. And what Milley is doing is drawing a line in the sand against the chicken hawks in the Biden administration, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, NSC Director Jake Sullivan, who've never seen war and who don't have the lives of thousands and thousands of men on the line. And he's saying, I will not commit U.S. troops. He's getting out ahead of them. So this is really a significant and actually terrifying moment in U.S. politics, especially after the midterms.
We can verify, of course, that the expenditure has exceeded what has been spent in Afghanistan, and certainly at a pro rata rate. What terrifies me, Max, is the willingness in pursuit of what appears to be little more than blunt profit and geopolitical and resource-based goals to take us to the precipice of the apocalypse. We spoke to Jeffrey Sachs when he was on the show about the same thing. Do you think that this is something that, how could you not consider that outcome, and why would you be willing to take the planet so close to annihilation if you had considered that potential outcome?
Yeah, why wasn't this considered in the beginning? Why wasn't it considered when the Minsk Accords were on the table? This was the path towards peace that the Donbass independent republics agreed to with Kiev, and every ceasefire was broken by Kiev with U.S. encouragement. So this was going on for the last 8 years. There were so many opportunities to prevent this conflict. And then once it broke out and Putin demonstrated that he wasn't bluffing, they invaded. You constantly heard in U.S. media that we can continue to increase our involvement and pour more money in, pour more advanced weapons in, like the HIMARS rocket system, which is enabling the Ukrainian advance. And Putin will not escalate. And now we see that escalation is taking place. Okay, one of the main symbols that Putin is most proud of is the Kerch Bridge between Crimea and the Russian Federation. It cost $4 billion to make with advanced engineering tactics. It was attacked by the Ukrainian SBU, and according to our reporting at the Gray Zone, it looks like there was at least British assistance there. Read Kit Clarenberg's report on our site. It's a blockbuster. They attacked that knowing that taunting him to escalate. And what did Russian forces do? They started attacking Ukrainian electrical infrastructure, and now large parts of Ukraine are having blackouts. So the escalation continued. Well, the U.S. media promised, and all the experts in the think tank said this wasn't going to happen. And now they're saying, fanatics like the neocon Ann Applebaum, who's a confidant of Hillary Clinton, major pro-war pundit in the U.S., she's saying we should call Putin's bluff on tactical nuclear weapons and continue to escalate. And tempting fate once again, but this time with nuclear weapons. These people are insane, and they don't care about us. They care about their profits, and this is their war, not ours. I live in Washington. I live in Ward 8 in Washington, D.C. It's a mostly monolithically Black area of the city. You do not see Ukrainian flags there. And you go across the river to the areas that are filling up with the contractors living in these new luxury condos, or you go across the Potomac River to Northern Virginia, and you see Ukrainian flags everywhere. Why? Because the people living there have skin in the game. The money that's going out to Ukraine from Ward 8 taxpayers and taxpayers across the country whose communities are being flooded with fentanyl and are facing all kinds of social problems, that's coming right back to those affluent areas in Washington, D.C. where the contractors live. Half of the Pentagon's budget goes to contractors, not to the troops. We're not supporting our troops with this money, and we're not actually supporting Ukrainian troops with this money.
What appears to be the truth to me, Max, and I've had a number of conversations that have verified this view, is that there are several strata of reality. One that is accessible to ordinary people, a sort of a saccharine covered version of events that invites you to view global affairs from behind a lens of simple, reductive, good, evil narratives. Meanwhile, there are interests that span administrations, agenda that take decades to fulfill, that we are not invited to contemplate and consider. We're given images of like returning troops, hugging grandmas and celebrating crowds returning home. And here on our channel, we're not suggesting that those aren't, in a way, certainly victories for Ukrainian people, for the residents of those towns, for people that have had their lives disrupted and destroyed by war. And I'm certainly not suggesting that Putin is anything other than a sort of a powerful world leader who has his own agenda and his own worldview. Merely what troubles me is the way that we are given information, the inability of the mainstream media and centralized political forces to say, this is what's happening, this is the complexity, these are the potential consequences. The entire thing leads me to believe that we're regarded as idiot children, only trusted with limited information. And I suppose I'm obviously beginning to query whether or not they have our best intentions at heart. I'm seriously, even your anecdotal example of the difference between the ward within which you live and the neighbouring one suggests that only a certain set of interests are being represented, and the rest of us have to make do with a kind of a palatable version of reality. Max, I could obviously talk to you for ages, but we have to wrap up this show.